The first thing I'd like to say is to pay my sincere respects to the traditional owners of this land, past, present and future. And when I first went to James Cook University, which is where Henry found himself in the early 1960s, I believe, I actually didn't know that Henry Reynolds was there. In fact, I didn't know who Henry Reynolds was. In fact, I knew nothing about Australia. And the irony was that the first unit I was given to teach in the Department of Social Work was indigenous and ethnic experience. And I was always wondering why people from the Indigenous Centre were always gave me these odd looks, like, who's this guy? You know, what does he know about anything? And they were perfectly right. By coincidence, I actually had done a master's in race and ethnic relations, as it was called, at Bristol University in England. And the head of the school, Professor Michael Banton, had written the definitive book on race relations, as it was called in those days, and it was a 1,000-page tome that had less than a quarter of a page on Indigenous Australians. Such was my knowledge at the time, and this is written the book that was written in the mid to late 1980s. Such was the knowledge about Indigenous Australia. We have, thanks to Professor Henry Reynolds and many of his colleagues, and not least the Indigenous communities of Australia, come a long way since. There are now many more books. I recall one of the first books I read in Australia was a wonderful book which I'm rereading currently, which is A Secret Country by John Pilger. And John Pilger recounts in that book his own education. I can't remember where it was, maybe Sydney, where he was reading a history book, the standard history book for schools at the time. And to paraphrase the sentence that was in the book, it said something along the lines of, in this country there are a people with no history, the Aboriginal Australians. Such was the standard teaching in schools in Australia at the time. So thanks to Professor Henry Reynolds and his many colleagues, amazing revisionist historians who effectively turned settler history on its head. So we went from glorifying the occupation and invasion of Australia to beginning to understand something of what Indigenous people experienced in this country. And what we know is that they fought bravely for their lands. Many, many lives were lost, tens of thousands of lives were lost, and there is still to this day no commemorative memorial to recognise those struggles that went on for many, many years.
Yes, there is. Mile 3.
Sure, okay. No major national. My view is there should be more monuments, there should be a museum deliberately and consciously devoted to this. It's a very important step, and Henry's been part of the campaign, I think, to try and ensure that that happens. I felt extremely honoured yesterday, amongst the crowd of 300 odd people who were there, to have Henry present. It's a real privilege and honour to have him here. He is, in every sense of the word, a towering figure. And he is, as Sally made clear yesterday, he has published many, many books. I mean, I've published about 13 books, Henry's published about 20. The recognition which has been given to Henry has been entirely deserved. He has a swathe of awards, prizes, and he's right, and it's correct that he should be acknowledged as one of Australia's treasures, as he is. A round of applause, please, Henry. I won't repeat all his books, but amongst his other books are The Other Side of the Frontier, The Law of the Land, The Whispering in Our Hearts, Fate of a Free People, Forgotten War, An Indelible Stain, Why Weren't We Told, a magnificent book, and more recently and importantly, vitally, Unnecessary Wars. We're going to do a straw poll. Who's actually read one of Henry's books? Wow, what does that say? For those who haven't, you've got some great reading ahead.
Speak to me later.
Severe reprimand coming. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, please make Professor Henry Reynolds welcome.
Well, thank you very much for your wonderful hospitality, and as I say, I was astonished by the size of the audience, and it wasn't just quantity, it was quality. The whole thing was just so professional. I didn't quite know what I was coming to, of course. You knew more about me than I knew about you. I wondered whatever this institute was up there somewhere in outer New South Wales, and I thought maybe 30 or 40 people might be there for the audience, so I was absolutely delighted, and I think it's a wonderful institution. Let me add that, and I should have mentioned this last night, I will be at the Byron Bay Writers Festival when there will be, it's a new edition of one of my older books, Whispering in Our Hearts, which is about the white humanitarians. And that will actually be launched, I think, here at Byron Bay. It's actually rushing through the process in order to be ready for Byron Bay. So there you are. As Richard was saying, I went to Townsville unexpectedly. I was living in London and I was offered a job in a place that I knew it was in Queensland. I wasn't quite sure where in Queensland. I didn't have a map to look it up. I thought it was about where Bundaberg was, and Margaret and I, who had grew up in Tasmania, teaching in London, ended up in this extraordinary frontier town, which it was. I mean, it was a frontier town in lots of ways, in that it was, the infrastructure was very, very poor and primitive. As I remember, they hadn't yet got their first streetlights. So it was a frontier town in that sense, but it was a frontier town in the way that most impacted on us, in that for the first time we came in contact with both Aborigines and Torres Strait Islanders. Now, the whole point about that was that it was a unique moment in the history of those cities, Townsville, Cairns, for instance, in that this was the time when suddenly you got a re-urbanisation of the Indigenous population. Now, by re-urbanisation, I use that word quite specifically because in the 19th and early 20th century, those towns always had fringe camps of Aboriginal people who worked in the town and often were driven out at night. But they were ever present in the small country towns all over Australia. Now, during the 20th century, Australia became obsessed about race, about white Australia, and one of the ways they did that was to make certain that practically all the Indigenous people were pushed out of the city, of the towns. They became white Australia. A few old Chinese remained, but not many, and the Aborigines, by and large, were put on reserves and missions. And Townsville had one of the largest reserves, Palm Island, just offshore. It was almost like a suburb, but people weren't allowed to leave. The Torres Strait Islanders had not been allowed onto Australian mainland. If they turned up from their luggers, they were simply put in jail, as happened to Mabo. Now, this all changed dramatically just as we arrived in Townsville. That is, the legislation changed in Queensland. People were allowed to leave Palm Island, as quite a lot of families did, came to Townsville. In the hinterland, the pastoralists were driving Aboriginal families off the property as the equal wage case came in. And the Torres Strait Islanders, who were brought to the mainland particularly to build the railway from Townsville to Mount Isa, to rebuild it, the men stayed behind and brought their families. So for the first time, you got a significant Indigenous presence in Townsville. And that's what we arrived to see. And to us, it was extraordinary. It was extraordinary. Now, as you may well ask, but surely in Tasmania you knew about Aborigines. Well, yes and no. We certainly knew there were people called half-castes who lived on the Bass Strait Islands, but I'd never seen one. Very, very few people identified as Aboriginal then. In the census of the 1960s, only about 60 people said they were Aboriginal. And so, they never sort of impinged. I mean, I never heard anyone, in all the many hours of undergraduate talking in the pubs, I never heard anyone talk about Aboriginal. It simply was not an issue. So we arrived to see this extraordinary situation, and we were astonished by the racism and the violence. I mean, it was absolutely blatant and, blatant, but in a way also unself-conscious. That is, people, they were reacting to the sudden appearance in their town of all these blacks. What are they doing here, And I'll just give you one little anecdote. Margaret, we lived near the centre of the town, so we're in town all day, in the town in Flinders Street, Townsville. And Margaret was pushing the pram with our firstborn up Flinders Street, where all the old pubs were with their swing doors. And just as she was going past, an Aboriginal bloke had been thrown out of the pub, as they were. Who do they think they are, trying to drink in our pubs? And fell on the footpath and hit his head on the fence, on the veranda post. And she stopped the pram, and little John, who must have been about 3, said, poor man, mummy. And so she got up and strode into the bar, a young woman going into a bar saying, quick, call the ambulance, this poor man's been hurt. And the barman looked at her and he shouted out to all the other blokes, they all seemed to be drinking in the morning in those days. And she said, quick help. And the barman said, Jesus, fellas, this young Sheila wants to help the nigger. To great amusement. So another occasion, we were, by this stage Margaret was an alderman in the City Council, and she was invited to see one of the old pubs had been done up. And the young woman, the wife of the then manager, had done up a nice new dining room. So she wanted Margaret to go and see it, which we did. Her husband was an ex-rugby player, very big. He had these huge arms, and he was going to fat. So he was telling us how God he had to clear the place up. He said, God, the front bar was full of niggers and the back bar was full of poofters. And he said, I fixed them eventually. I won't tell you the poofter story unless you want to hear it, because it is even more extreme. But he said, I soon cleared the front bar out, and he showed us his fist, and he had all of these, scars on his fist where he had bashed people until all the blacks went away and never came back. Now that was Townsville, the towns we arrived in. Now I was asked as soon as I arrived to teach Australian history. Now you probably also may not appreciate that I had done no Australian history. I'd done a bit, learned a little bit in primary school, virtually nothing in secondary school, and nothing at university. There was no Australian history being taught. So I had to do a lot of quick reading in the few months I had before the year started in 1966, and take my first 2 small courses of Australian history. Now, the course was being run from Queensland, and the textbook was the textbook of the God professor in Brisbane called Gordon Greenwood, Professor of History and Politics, one of the really big men of Australian history. And this was a multi-authored volume that was the official history that had been written for the 50 years of Federation. It came out a bit late, but it was sort of an official history. And this was the most widely prescribed book in universities and senior schools. And in many ways, it was a good book. But the extraordinary thing about it was it had nothing about the Aborigines. Literally, wasn't even an index entry. Now, if I had been teaching somewhere else in Australia, I may not have realised But when you were living in North Queensland and your students came from North Queensland, often from much smaller places than Townsville, they knew that this was probably the single most important issue in North Queensland. And I knew, I'd learned, I'd come to realise this. So I then looked up in all the reviews of this book, and if you weren't in the book, you reviewed it. So together there may have been 15 of the most prominent historians in the country. Not only was there nothing in the book, but none of the reviewers realised there was something wrong with this history. So that's why I said, well, I have to put the blacks into the course. So how do I do that? So I went to the library, and there was almost nothing there. Certainly nothing about Queensland, except an extraordinary books like the book by Raphael Salento and Clem Lack called Triumph in the Tropics, which had the most extraordinary racist stuff in it. As Salento said, they were like dogs, They could be savage, but if you stared them down, they were obedient. I mean, astonishing stuff. So I had to start doing my own research. Now, it wasn't my original intention to do that, to become an historian of Aboriginal settler relations, but I needed to start doing the research for my teaching. And I quickly discovered, that it was an extraordinary story. Above all, there was this unbelievable history of violence. And one of the only resources I had in North Queensland was that they still had the full file of the Port Denison Times in the newspaper office in Bowen. So you drive down to Bowen, and here are the great big and I mean, the paper is just full of violence, and the violence spills out of the newspaper. And this had been forgotten. Now, when I say forgotten, I mean that because they knew about this in the 19th century. They wrote about it. It wasn't that violence was there or not. It's whether it was legitimate and justifiable. There wasn't any debate about the reality of it. So I started doing teaching in this way, and after a few years I said, well, I better get down and do research, and so I eventually went all over Australia looking at all the 19th century records, and the amount of written stuff is just extraordinary. And eventually, having written some articles, I published The Other Side of the Frontier. But let me emphasise that this wasn't seen as a good career move. I'm quite serious. I mean, the first things I published were some 19th century Tasmanian history, because that's what I'd been working on before I went to England. I did an MA. And I had given my first paper to a big history conference on 19th century Tasmania, and one of the princes of the profession, who was the editor of the overwhelmingly important history journal, said, well now, young Reynolds, what are you going to do now you're up there in Queensland? And I said, I think I might do something about the Aborigines. He said, oh my God, no, there's nothing in that. Which wasn't encouraging. Now, at much that same time, the first serious work was being done, not by historians, but by the Social Science Research Council and Charles Rowley. Some of you may know that there was that trilogy of Charles Rowley published in 1970, 71, 72. And it was sponsored and paid for by the Social Science Research Council. Now, Charles said to me, he said, when I was doing my research, when I was commissioned to do this work, I went around to all the history departments in the country to see if they were interested in this project. He said, do you know, not only was no one interested, but they seemed to think it was absolutely disreputable. And then finally, and this will be the final story in this little part of the reminiscences, when I had written The Other Side of the Frontier, and I knew that it was quite new and innovative, and I sent it off to Penguin, And the answer came back, oh yes, well, we don't think we'll publish it. There's already too much about Aborigines. So that was the background, you know, that I emerged from the far north, whoosh, writing this new sort of history. But as I say, it wasn't, the extraordinary thing wasn't that I was writing a new sort of history, it's just that it had been so neglected. And if you, as I did, if you compared, you know, there was a rash of books about history books of Australia written in that period. If you looked at those books and you compared them with a comparable history of New Zealand, like Sinclair's History of New Zealand, the first third of the book, New Zealand, was about the Maoris, and then they were ever present. And I mean, the index entry for Maoris was pages compared to the situation in Australia. Australia was, it was all very odd, but there was this complete silence. And as the famous, one of the most famous events in this intellectual history was when the anthropologist Bill Stanner gave the 1968 lectures for the ABC, the Boyer lectures, called After the Dreaming, in which he said that, you know, historians were engaged in a conspiracy of silence. And it was that conspiracy of silence that I began to break into, as at much the same time there were a few young historians in different parts of the country who were starting to do this. But it was very much just the beginning, and of course since then it really has blossomed out into a, you know, a dramatic, very dramatic situation of change. Now, clearly, since that time, there has been, you know, a revolution in the way Australians write the history, and in many people the way they understand the history, and partly because the history has provided the raw material for so many other genres. That is, you know, painters and poets and novelists and songwriters, people who don't have time or the interest or the skills to do the history, but they use the history in all of these other genres, and that is an important part of the whole story. And even more significantly was that by the early 1970s, Aboriginal politics had really come to be close to the centre stage, and the most dramatic event was, of course, the setting up of the Tent Embassy on Australia Day 1972. And from then on, clearly Aboriginal politics have been all important. But there are, of course, remaining issues, and I'll mention some of these, and we can discuss some of those questions. Now, one is, what do we indeed do? What do we do about frontier conflict, frontier violence? This was at the centre of the history wars of the early years of the century. This remains contentious, but I can update you on that. There's the whole question of how do we, what do we do about putting the Australian settler experience together with the Aboriginal experience. Most of the old history books would begin the story with the arrival of the Europeans. But remember, archaeology was back. It was only in the 1960s that you began to get serious archaeology in Australia. I mean, archaeology was going off to the Mediterranean, you know, digging in the ruins of Greek and Middle Eastern civilizations. And it was only in the 1960s that John Mulvaney in particular began to do archaeology in Australia. And when they got their first date of 10,000 years, that was extraordinary. My goodness me, it's 10,000 years old. And of course, progressively, that's been pushed back, and the early history of Australia gets larger and larger and larger and looms over us in a way it certainly didn't in the past. So there's the question of Australia Day. That's clearly contentious everywhere. I've been involved in that debate. As you know, it will no doubt come again this Australia Day, and that debate will continue. So there's frontier conflict. There's the question of Australia Day. There's the question also about this whole issue of what broadly can be termed sovereignty. What do we do about the question of pre-existing sovereignty? What do we do about treaties? All of these questions are very, very important still and confront us. I mean, the Uluru Statement, which was so peremptorily rejected by the Prime Minister, that is there as an ongoing and profoundly important question. And in some ways, these issues are not just specific and single issues. They touch upon this whole question of what it means to be an Australian. You know, and so therefore it comes into the question of Britain and the Republic and the flag and all of these things. So they're all, in one way or another, relate back to this question of how we come to terms with the continent itself, but also with the Indigenous, the First Nations, as we now quite correctly call them.
You mentioned last night a difference between New Zealand and Australia, and I just wanted to plunder your historical knowledge about why was it so different. We know that they have a treaty and so on, but why did it unfold so differently? Is it the vastness or what?
No, very good question. Why was Australia different? Well, Australia was different also from North America. See, in North America, two things. One, the Indians were recognised as owning the land, and that was done by the British first. The famous proclamation of 1763 recognised the property rights of the Indians in what both was the United States and then Canada. And they also recognised that the Indians had a form of sovereignty and that you had to negotiate with them over that sovereignty. In other words, you had to have treaties. Because you can only lose sovereignty in one of two ways, either by conquest or by cession, by treaty making. And there are 500 treaties made in the United States. In many cases they were broken, partly because the new American government simply had no force to stop the settlers just continually just intruding into Indian land. But there was that recognition that the Indians had pre-existing rights of government, law and property. Now that had been so from at least the 1720s when they started making treaties. Now that tradition continued in both the United States, but particularly in Canada. The whole of Canada was settled by treaty, by 19th century treaties up to the 1920s, and then by modern treaties. Now, the difference, I'll come back to that. So that was the normal way of dealing with Indigenous people. And that was the international law when Australia was being settled. Now, why didn't that happen in Australia? Well, it's a very, very interesting question. My view is that the British, when they arrived with the assumption that Australia was largely uninhabited. Now, in a way, this is confirmed in the only time that the settlement of Australia was discussed by the Privy Council, the highest legal authority in the empire, was in a case in the 1880s when they said Australia was settled as a tract largely uninhabited without a settled population. Now, by settled they didn't mean agricultural, and this is important, they meant living in one place. But the largely uninhabited is the most important thing. Now, I think this goes back to the advice of Sir Joseph Banks. Now, remember, Banks was a great aristocrat. He was the president of the Royal Society, and above all, he was with Cook. And he was a botanist. And he was interviewed in 1784 when they were deciding where they'd send convicts, before they had decided on Botany Bay. And Banks's advice was that apart from a small population around the coast of people who live from the sea, it must be uninhabited because there are no edible plants in Australia. And so the assumption was that it was largely uninhabited. In fact, when they arrived in 1788, the first thing they were surprised was how many people there were, before smallpox, how many people there were around Sydney. Secondly, they were surprised when they saw smoke in the Blue Mountains. And surprisingly, Philip sent an expedition to find the fire in order to see what they'd been eating, on the assumption they must have carried fish into the Blue Mountains to eat, because there was nothing else there they could eat. But of course they soon discovered that wherever they went, there were people. And they also soon discovered that although they lived by, the chase and by gathering, they lived in particular locations. I mean, they soon learnt which groups lived all around Sydney and that they had their specific territories. But the law was decided in Britain, and it was when the proclamations were read on the 7th of February 1788, not on the 26th of January, which is an unimportant date in many ways. On the 7th of February, when they had their great gathering, everyone was ashore and they all lined up, and the soldiers, and they fired their barrages of musket fire, and they read the proclamations. That was when the whole of the land of Eastern Australia became Crown land. The whole of Eastern Australia became Crown land. And of course, they also basically said, well, the Aborigines have no government, no laws, so therefore they all become British subjects. Now that was the beginning, and that remained the situation until the Mabo case. But in Tasmania, the Governor Arthur, 1824-1836, was there for that whole period of the conflict. He again and again said it was a pity we didn't begin with a treaty, that would have made it much easier, as much as anything else, to control the settlers. It was a great mistake we didn't begin with a treaty. He had been in the Americas, he knew about treaties. He had the famous American Supreme Court case that defined native Indian title in his papers. He knew that it was a mistake. And the violence that came about was a result. Now, the violence in Tasmania was substantial, and above all, the number of Europeans who were killed. 250 Europeans were killed by the Aborigines in Tasmania. This is astonishing in terms of Australian history. So it was very violent. I mean, the whole colony was totally disrupted for years by the Black War. And Arthur knew this. Now, the interesting thing is that Arthur went back to London in he was there for the second half of 1836, and he was the man on the spot, had been there for 12 years, highly regarded bureaucrat, and this was when they were discussing the settlement of New Zealand. Now, I am sure that it was Arthur's strong advice that you must begin with a treaty. Now, if the Aborigines, no military organisation like the Maoris, the most simple weapons, no spear throwers, simple unbarbed spears and clubs, if they could almost bring the colony to a standstill, whatever would happen in New Zealand. And so indeed the treaty was drawn up. They arrived in New Zealand with the treaty. And that made a very big difference. They also arrived with the assumption that the Maoris owned their land. And so that, and also almost the Maori population, particularly in North Island, was much denser and larger, but it was the way in which it was dealt with by the British that was so important. And that had returned to the centre of Britain's relations with Indigenous people. So when they, for instance, went into Fiji in 1870, there was complete recognition of the Fijians, of the Melanesians' property rights, and you couldn't buy land. You can't. I mean, and that British policy was taken to Papua. That the Papuans owned their land, and you couldn't buy land. So, in a way, Australia fits into that strange period when the traditions were left behind. And it may have been they were left behind by mistake, or by misapprehension about the nature of Australia, and it became absolutely customary. And as I say, it took 200 years to correct the legal mistake and the tragic mistake, because it predetermined conflict. To conclude, this is a long answer.
Fascinating, it's great, thank you. I learned a lot.
Just to conclude, if we compare Queensland and Canada, now at much the same time, both societies expanded into huge areas. Queensland, remember, started with a very, very small population in the southeast, and they had this huge territory stretching right up into the tropics that was still Aboriginal territory, and a population that almost certainly hadn't been decimated by smallpox. Canada was much the same. I mean, the Canadian settlement in the Atlantic was old, as you know, both Quebec and Ontario, but they didn't really begin to spread in serious way, apart from the fur trade, into the West until the second half of the 19th century. That is between the Great Lakes and the Rockies. Now, you've got two comparable colonies, same legal system, same sort of settlers, much the same time moving into new territory. Now in Queensland it was incredibly violent and brutal, and the new work being done suggests there may have been 50,000 or so Aborigines killed in the 40 or 50 years it took to occupy that huge territory. In Canada there was no violence. No Indians were killed. It was all done by a series of treaties, the numbered treaties, right across the prairies. The treaties were negotiated by the Mounties, and they still exist, the numbered treaties. The Indians certainly were compressed into small reservations, but they negotiated and they got all sorts of concessions, and those treaties still exist. And so every year the government goes out and sits down and they talk about the treaty and they hand over the treaty objects. But above all, it was peaceful. There was a rebellion of the Métis, but that's another story. But the difference in two colonies at much the same time, I mean one warm, one cold, but nonetheless expanding into huge territories, is absolutely astonishing. Absolutely astonishing. So the legal system and the way in which it was done was all important.
It seems extraordinary that, because there were written accounts from, I think, 1780 of the first people that came in, saying that on the east coast there were fields for miles and miles of yams, and on the west coast there were again miles and miles of grains, with haystacks at intervals for as far as they could see. So, and also there were stone buildings in the Adelaide area. So they must have been just really in denial. Conscious.
Well, no, but the law had been decided. This is a British problem. As I say, Australia's like, God, we were dreadful. Go back to where the dreadfulness started. And it started with decisions made in London. So even if, I mean, there were settlers, who realised this and had their own private treaties. There were settlers who had good relations because they, like the Archers just a bit farther north, said, well, they own the land, we just use the grass. Now the British actually did endeavour to the one thing they did, and people don't quite realise this, was the pastoral lease. Now the British didn't know what to do. They wanted to confine settlement, like the Americans tried to. They wanted to contain settlement within a reasonable area, simply to maintain control and have schools and churches and have a civilised society. But from the 1830s, they had no control because the squatters just went out. Whoosh, they pushed aside. They weren't real barriers. There was nothing the British could do any more than the United States could do. There was no force to stop them going out from New South Wales, way out, with 10 years they were 1,000 kilometres away from Sydney. both in all directions, including into Victoria, and they came over from Tasmania into Victoria, and you had this totally uncontrolled, unregulated settlement, which was obviously violent. The squatters believed that they had every right to squat, that it was Crown land, and the British said, what are we going to do? Look, you know, this is wild. They are violent. They are killing the Aborigines. They are exterminating. They say this again and again in their little memos in the Colonial Office. Extirpate is the word they use. What are we going to do? We've got to control this absolutely uncontrolled spread of settlement. Because they said it's not like Kentucky. You know, it's not proceeding at the speed of the plough. It's going whoosh. What are we going to do? How are we going to bring this back into control? And above all, how do we stop them being able to claim property by long occupation, by prescription as it's called? If they had gone out and said, well, I've been on this land for 20 years, I'm going to claim against the Crown, it now becomes mine. So they had to do something. So they started off by giving the squatters licences, grazing licences. They had to pay. There had to be a recognition that they were on Crown land. The squatters by the 1830s, 40s were very powerful, rich and powerful. And so they agitated, and eventually in 1846 the Colonial Office agreed that they would give them long-term leases. Once again recognising the Crown's ownership but giving them leases. And this was proceeding when that much maligned figure from Tasmania, or from England, into George Augustus Robinson, who was the protector of Aborigines in Port Phillip, wrote in his report saying, this is a disastrous situation. The squatters are now treating the Aborigines as what do you do when you... No. When you trespass as trespassers. And a court case in Port Phillip said, yes, if an Aborigine trespasses on your lease, you have the same rights as you would if an ordinary European got on your lease. And if they wouldn't leave, you could shoot at them. And that was just the law. And Robinson wrote all this and said, this is disastrous. They soon will have no legal place for their feet. This report went to Sydney. Maybe no one read it. Robinson was a terrible old bore. They didn't care what he said. It went to London. And in London, the Colonial Office officials reading this realised this was a problem. And they asterisked by the side of the page and they underlined it, and it went up the chain to the Minister, Earl Grey, who said, goodness me, we didn't mean this. We didn't mean that these leases would dispossess and mean that the Aborigines had no rights. And he said, well, in other parts we set aside reservations for the Indigenous people, but this won't work in Australia because neither the pastoralists both the pastoralists and the Aborigines need a large area of land. And the Aborigines need to be able to walk across their traditional lands, have access to hunt and to have their ceremony, and they should have the rights to continue doing this everywhere except fenced land which was being cultivated. So they created a new clause that came in under the 1846 Imperial Land Act, which created the pastoral lease, which did say that the pastoralist only had the right to use the land for pastoral purposes, and that did not extinguish the continuing rights of the Indigenous people to use it. Now, pastoral leases, because they then came into Australian law in New South Wales, which included the whole of the east at the time, so then therefore Victoria and Queensland, separately done in South Australia, separately done in Western Australia, all their land acts had to had to incorporate the pastoral lease. Now the thing is that this wasn't enforced in 19th century Australia, but what it meant was that the pastoralists, many people have had these pastoral leases for generations, and it suited people because they got their land to use the land very cheaply. They didn't have to buy it. But over the generations, they assumed the land was theirs. We've been on this land for 3 generations. My grandparents are buried up there in the corner. This is our country. And the astonishing thing is it wasn't until the Wick case in 1996 that for the first time an Australian court looked at the pastoral lease. Now all the advice, even people like Noel Pearson and dear Father Frank Brennan said, don't you worry, a lease is a lease and a lease gives you absolute rights for a period of time, and that must have extinguished native title. Shock horror, this is not the case. They weren't really leases, they were only licenses which did not extinguish native title. And so at least some form of property rights, of use rights, still continue to exist on pastoral leases all over Australia. I mean, a third of the country. And so that was the only thing the British government did to protect the rights of Aborigines, and it wasn't really affirmed in the law until 1996. But that was the only. They also tried in South Australia to say that the land has to be purchased and you have to set aside reserves for the Aborigines. You see, the law, the international law at the time was you had to recognise Indigenous rights. But nomadic peoples use up more land than necessary. So what you can do is you can confine them, but you can't totally dispossess them. So what you should do is to set up reservations for them so they can learn agriculture and become more productive. So it was a way you could push them aside, but you couldn't completely dispossess them. But as I say, in Australia, that idea of reservations fell by the wayside because so much of the country was pastoral country.
Henry, can I ask a question?
You speak up.
Oh, sorry. Oh, sure.
Yeah, I've got a question.
Big boys.
Yeah, do you think that the absence of recognition of the Aboriginal...
Stand up. Sorry, I can't hear you. See you.
Do you think that the absence of recognition of the Aboriginals' ownership of the land accounts for the ignorance? Accounts for the ignorance of Aboriginal history in the 20th century?
Good question. I mean, the fundamental point is that from at least the 1880s through to at least the beginning of the Second World War, the assumption was the Aborigines were a dying race. 2 things convinced them. One, there clearly was. Everyone knew that once upon a time when I was young there were lots of Aborigines about here, and a year ago old Queen Mary, the last of the natives, died. And if you look at the newspapers of the 1880s, everywhere Queen Mary or King Billy has just passed away, and there was often considerable affection for them. They've been around the village for all this time and they were the last of the natives, and they're now gone. And the demography showed, a continuing decline in the full-blood population. So there was empirical evidence, but this fitted into the overwhelming dominant intellectual paradigm of the age, which was social Darwinism, evolution, that there was a constant churning of life, and that species died, and that the human people were like this, and the primitive people were dying out. And so they just assumed that the Aborigines would disappear. And remember that most people, Australia was, an unusually urban society. It was one of the most, although it had a vast hinterland, it was one of the most urbanised countries in the world. And the cities were amongst the biggest and the fastest growing in the world. And most people had no experience, whatever, of Aboriginal life. And in those days there were no 4-wheel drives, there was no easy access to the north or the interior. Most people had no experience, and they just said, oh, they're a dying race, we must care for them. The expression was smooth the dying pillow. So there was that just assumption that they were significant once, but no longer. But there is a point about what you ask, because where the indigenous people had something, i.e. ownership of property, and you had to negotiate with them, you had to learn their languages, you had to learn something about their government, you had to learn who to negotiate with, and so you learnt more about them because you had to. But when you had said, look, they don't own anything, then there was no need to talk to them at all. So all those things came together, but the dying race thing is overwhelmingly important. But also, by the 1880s, the Australians began to create the sense of themselves, a sense of nationalism. And it was particularly important around 1888, the centenary of the first settlement in New South Wales. They began to create a history that they could admire. So, until we found, decided the digger was the national hero, it was the pioneer. So the early history that they wrote was about the settlement of the land, even though it was such an urban society, but the settlement of the land. The hardy pioneers who went out and, above all, it was a struggle against nature. It was it was heroic rather than dramatic. It was heroic that they were struggling with nature, with distance and drought and bushfire and flood, all of those things which are right, true. They didn't make it up. This was an important story, and so that's why the explorers were so important. That's why children were endlessly bored with all the history of exploration. All the lines across the map, all the maps of the spread of settlement. This became the central national story. And the Aborigines buggered it up. These heroic pioneers were killers. Now, neither side wanted to admit the violence that had accompanied the settlement. The settlement wanted to be, and there are many, many books that said Australia was unique in being peacefully settled. And it was a very comforting story. And generations of Australians were brought up on that. And that's why when people like me and those of my generation came along and said, oh, look, they're killers, they were shocked and horrified. And people learn things at school they carry with them for the rest of their life. And so we were making it up. What were we doing? What were we doing? Destroying this nice story. And the funny thing was, it was all right to go and kill Turks, get some blood on your bayonet, because that made you a man and made you an Australian. But we didn't want to talk about the killing at home. And so it came as a shock. And people were shocked and very aggressive about recasting the history. But once you put the Aborigines back into the story, they can't be put on a lean-to out the back. They've got to come into the centre of the story.
Can I comment on...
Sorry, I should go first. Sorry, Henry.
Big voice.
Yeah, sorry, I will ask. When Cook laid claim to Australia, it was a bit of an afterthought. He had left the continent, he was sailing north, and he stuck a flag into Possession Island. And he claimed a whole continent as a nation, as a single nation. It'd be a bit like putting a flag into the toe of Italy and claiming Norway, and the whole of Europe. I'm just wondering whether the treaties we make could be regionals. In other words, we could forge, as NGARA, could start to begin conversations with the Bundjalung people to form a nation treaties on a nation-by-nation basis, because Australia was a continent of 700 nations. So I'm just wondering whether the treaties should be regional rather than this idea of nation.
Absolutely. Do some reading on the Canadian experience, where they consciously, there had been regional treaties. They started their modern treaty making again in the last generation, and they consciously went back and said it's important we have regional treaties. I think they did conclude, however, that the treaty will only be significant if you actually have a body you can negotiate with and you agree upon quite distinct things of the giving of what Crown land is left to that group, recompense, all of those things. And I think they decided you need to have a reasonable sized group to treaty with. I think it might have been 10,000, which may be a problem in Australia, but it wouldn't be if you said, well, one treaty, we'll start in Torres Strait, we'll have Cape York, East-West Cape York, we'll have Arnhem Land, we'll have East Kimberley, West Kimberley. You can do that sort of thing, and I think that is undoubtedly the way to do it. And that would mean, I think it's important, that much more of the money would go to traditional people living in the remote parts of Australia, and that's really where the money has to go. But you raised another question.
The idea of an ambit claim.
Oh yes, no. Now people don't quite appreciate what those claims were. Now they were claims not looking inward to the traditional owners, they were looking outward to the other European powers. They were treaties, they were claims against other Europeans. They were putting the flag saying to the French and maybe the Spaniards, but certainly that this is now the area which we can now come to and work out our relationship inward. It's very much a claim to external sovereignty, not internal sovereignty.
Okay, thank you.
Can I comment on...
You'll have to speak up.
Can I comment on your...
No, they won't hear you because you're talking to me.
Oh, sorry.
Won't stand up.
The comment that you made, about non-recognition of the violence before your book came out and history started to be rewritten. I lived in the Mackay area in North Queensland, south of Townsville, for about 27 years before I came to live here. And there are stories about the slaughter at the Leap, where they chased an Aboriginal woman and her baby off the cliff at the Leap near Mackay. And it's a bit in the shape of that, but it's well-known communal story and history. And also I lived on a smaller station south of Mackay in the 1980s, and I met this lady on a neighbour's property. This woman was 90, and she had come from the Nebo area, which is a grazing area west of Mackay, between Mackay and the mining hinterland. And she told me, I was just astonished, she told me that her father used to go on Aboriginal hunts, like pig hunts.
Happened here too. Yeah, people jumping off the cliff and Evan's head being chased off.
200 people jumped, women largely.
Yeah. So it is there in communal history.
Yeah, so I mean it's there in the written history. You know, if you ever wanted to go back and get the early copies of the Mackay Mercury, it is the Mercury, isn't it?
Yes.
You'd find that there it was openly discussed. But the funny thing is I'm sceptical of these massacre stories. I'm sceptical because the assumption is that the Aborigines were silly enough to get caught in such situations when they were far from being easy to catch. They were very hard. And every part of Australia has a story about people being driven off a cliff. And they are all so similar that as I say, the detailed experience of Tasmania, where there were soldiers and there were parties of whites out all the time, was that the Aborigines were far, had so much experience and knew the bush so much well and could hide so well that they could never get them into a group to kill. The only way they could kill them was to get them there in their campfires at first light. That's when the killing was done. But I'm sceptical about the cliff stories, but there are so many. Someone should collect them. And they have there's a suspicious similarity about them, as though they're something out of European. There's a European law back there somewhere. I mean, that may be, but as I say, the traditional problem that the Europeans had of actually being able to find. Now, when they were all on horseback, particularly in the open country, that is more likely, but certainly in the mountainous, the forested parts of Australia, it was very hard to actually find out where the Aborigines were. So they were far more skillful in the bush than the Europeans, and the Europeans made so much noise. You know, they would have known they were coming hours before they actually arrived by smoke signals. You know, they'd light a fire and they'd know something was on going down there, and they'd either see them at a great distance or they'd hear them. And by the time the Europeans arrived, they were gone. So it's you know, it's an interesting, very interesting thing. But I'm fascinated by the falling off cliff stories. Absolutely.
Okay. A friend of mine in Arnhem Land in Yirrkala, Jawa, he said to me once, you know, Wittich, John, why do you Ballanda call my law a dream? He said, when I hear that dream, I feel sick. It's my law. So I won't go into the linguistics of that nonsense word, dream and dreaming. It's just a fantasy by people who didn't know the Aboriginal languages and suited something. So, you know, in the lyrics of the song Treaty, there's some phrases that say, you know, our law wasn't extinguished when you planted your Union Jack, etc. Our river there are two rivers running in this country, referring to Gunma theory, where the mingling of waters. And I look forward to a brighter day when the true rivers will actually meet. But that requires the recognition that there are a people of laws, not just LORE, quaint stories, etc. So treaty is the idea of having a treaty now is nonsense without the recognition of that. A different type of law based on a different intellectual tradition and profound intellectual tradition.
No, one of the problems was that so much of the early collecting was done by within the sort of the folklore tradition.
Yeah.
And as you know, they collected many stories about folklore all over the country. Now, some of that was taken up in early anthropology, and that is true, but once again, it was Mabo, the Northern Territory Land Act first, and then Mabo, whereas, you know, the group had to establish that they had a law about country and property and transfer of property. And that means now that all over the country, people had to do the work, and often with the assistance of linguists and historians, to establish they have to be able to prove a pre-existing law over that particular territory to gain native title. So in a way, it's native title that's changed that, but that's about property. Now, sovereignty is a different matter. Australians often confuse the two, property and sovereignty, but they are two profoundly different areas of law about different things. Now, Australia still hasn't, there is still an absolute unresolved question about sovereignty. Because, as I said before, sovereignty can be acquired if there is a pre-existing sovereignty, and although no Australian court has yet construed that, but it is there by implication in Mabo, but there's been no judgment in an Australian court to say there was a pre-existing sovereignty. But the assumption clearly is there, should be that there is, and if the Australian courts won't do it and they say, oh no, we can't do that because we are a product of that claim of sovereignty, they can't go behind that, but that's ridiculous. We can no longer appeal to the, thank goodness, to the Privy Council after 1886, I think they should get a judgment from the World Court.
Yeah.
They should get an opinion, an opinion from the World Court about pre-existing sovereignty. Now the question then arises, what happened to it? Now the Australian could say yes, as the tough minded say, yeah, well we just conquered you lot, we beat you and we conquered it, and that was a legitimate way to gain sovereignty right up until after the Second World War. And no court anywhere would doubt that you could acquire sovereignty by conquest. But we don't want to do that. Everyone's opposed to that idea. Well, the only other way is by treaty. That is, you've got to sit down and negotiate what has happened with the pre-existing sovereignty. So the question arises, how legally do you describe the acquisition of sovereignty in Australia? Well, now it's very difficult, and the only way there was a parliamentary committee which looked at this, and I've forgotten the title of it. I don't even have the paper any longer, and they discussed this question. And what they came up with, well, what would appear to be the case in Australia, that it has been acquired by long occupation, by prescription. That is, the Europeans came in and occupied the land and have done so for a long period of time, and that is enough to give you title, The problem with that is that, and most people don't realise this, that fundamental to that law of adverse possession is acquiescence by the previous owner. And I don't think any court could be persuaded the Aborigines were acquiescent. So there's this fundamental problem the Australian law can't describe. So did sovereignty disappear instantly, or did it? Well, that's ridiculous, because there were people still living on their country, living in a traditional way to the 1960s. The last people came in the 1960s, and certainly, say, in Eastern Australia, the claim in 1770 and backed up in 1788. I mean, there were people in the remote parts of North Queensland who were still living on their land, using their traditional law well into the 20th century. So was sovereignty acquired little bit by little bit over a long period of time? And that, it's very complicated. The question arises, is sovereignty one single thing or divisible? And this is an important legal question. The British have always said, oh, your sovereignty is single. There's one single all-powerful sovereign because it comes from the Crown. It can't be divided. Hence the British said, oh, you can't have federations. You can't break the sovereignty up. But of course you can. And Australia did it with federation. We broke the sovereignty into two and put one lot there and one lot there. So if you can break sovereignty up once, you can break it up numerous times. So do people like the Yolngu or the Tiwi continue to have a form of sovereignty that has not extinguished and still exists? And that is a question that exists over certainly large areas of Australia. And I'll finish with a story which I just heard last week from a young Aboriginal lawyer, their first Aboriginal senior, Queen's Senior Counsel in New South Wales. Comes from a Townsville family. And he said, you may not have heard, but our Bonnie Prince Charlie was up in Arnhem Land. Up in Arnhem Land. He went on a private visit. It was scarcely reported. But what happened was that when he was there, the senior men sort of grabbed him and said, you've got to come, we've got an important message to give you, but you must come to our sacred ground. So they took him there and they gave him a message stick. And they said, this is for you to take to that mob in Canberra to tell them that we are sovereigns here. We still have sovereignty here. Now, whether Charles put it in his pocket and forgot it, whether he threw it, whether he took it back, or whether it's going to be in the archives in Windsor, who knows? But those people who are still on, like the Torres Strait Islanders, they are still on their country. There have been very few Europeans ever there. They still use their own traditions, and that's true over a large area of the north. Do these people still have sovereignty? And I mean, I think they do, but you know, what's going to happen when eventually, I mean, there have been cases about sovereignty. There have been bad cases where people living in the south are saying, I've still got sovereignty. Now, it's like Mabo. If you want to win a case, you've got to choose your best place, not a weak place. You've got to choose a place where there is very, very strong evidence. Say Torres Strait, or the Tiwi Islands, or the Yongu, or people in the Kimberley who you know, are there, have always been there, and there have been very, very few Europeans have ever been there. Yep.
Just a comment which is related to the last one in some way. In the latest quarterly essay, Mark McKenna talks extensively about the inability to face facts or the whole truth, and he has a suggestion about one way which would be related to the acknowledgement we make of traditional owners, simply by saying, acknowledge the traditional owners whose land was taken without consent or compensation. That's all. Just a simple addition like that. Put it in more people's faces directly. That's all I wanted to say.
Yes, no, I know Mark, and I've read that. You know, I think it's a pretty good effort. And I'm interested where he said, well, you've got to do the Republic, because in the Republic, I mean, the fundamental question is the sovereignty still resides in the Crown, in the British Crown, and you know, there's bullshit about her being the Queen of Australia. I mean, it resides in the British Crown, and our flag shows that. I mean, people say, oh, it's our flag. Well, it's not. It's a British colonial flag. And if they say the flag's important, well, if the flag is important, you've got to know what the flag means. And flags have meaning. And the fact that in that quadrant up there in that corner means that Britain is sovereign. It's Brand Britannia. And it indicates, you know, where the sovereignty resides. And the sovereignty is delegated to the Governor-General and downwards. But still the idea that sovereignty comes down from above, not up from the people. And so if you indeed, you know, eventually establish the Republic, that completely opens up the question of where the sovereignty comes from, and that may well mean that at that time you can deal with that. My problem with that, and I wrote to Mark about this, I said, look, I agree with you entirely. I wrote a book about sovereignty and I've talked about it all over Australia, and my worry is that people just don't understand. They understand about the Republic and about Britain, they don't understand about sovereignty, and they don't understand about treaties. How can you make a treaty outside your own country? They know nothing about the experience elsewhere. They might know a bit about New Zealand, they know nothing about Canada, and so it takes a lot of explaining. And I often found that it was very hard to explain these concepts to an Australian audience, whereas, you know, the Republic is easier. And I feel if you try and combine the two, you make both more difficult. But, you know, that's just a personal view of tactics rather than anything else. Big voice. I can't hear. There's too much noise there.
Why do you think Malcolm Turnbull didn't accept the Uluru Statement, and what is the potential of that statement they made?
Oh, I think because he's a hopeless man. An utterly disappointing man who, you know, has done nothing to be remembered by except grabbing the prime ministership, and then that's all he wanted, and all the other things that he supposedly believed in just disappeared, and he's been totally gutless in dealing with his opponents in the right. He should have confronted them and stared them down and said, all right, you know, if you won't accept what I want, tell the National Party, all right, you leave the coalition, see where you get. But clearly he never once stood up. He was never a man, never an Anzac. Oh, I think. Look, it's an extraordinary. Let's remember, it was the result of endless talk all over the country, endless negotiation. One of the biggest sort of large numbers of people negotiating, bringing it down to a synthesis, very brief, very eloquent, an extraordinary statement, and extremely important. providing white Australia with a way of indeed incorporating the two worlds. Very, very important. And I think to dismiss it in the way it was done, virtually with contempt, was absolutely appalling. And it may do two things. As you saw Noel, I mean, I've known Noel since he was a teenager. I haven't always agreed with him. But he was the one who felt if you courted the right, courted the big end of town, I mean, if you go around Australia and the most conservative people go, oh, I agree with Noel Pearce. No, he really has got a constituency and he courted it to the right. And he assumed that that was the way to get change. You can understand the tactic, but as he admitted in that famous essay of his, it absolutely collapsed. Absolutely collapsed. And as it had collapsed, I think where Abbott was saying, well, these niggers living out there in their little communities, they've all got to come into proper settlements. A terrible, terrible thing. So there's a lifestyle choice. I mean, dreadful, appalling stuff. Now, one wonders if the Yolngu, they've done two things interesting recently. One, this thing about Prince, but also they sent a memo to the federal government saying, we are sick and tired of all these people in the south claiming Aboriginality and getting all the money and it's not being spent on us. Now, if they wanted to, they could decide to take their case back internationally. If I was doing their strategy in that sense, I would tell them to appoint a roving ambassador, ideally one who also had Asian ancestry, as so many people in the north do, and send them around the world, as Romus Horta did, explaining to people all over the world about the situation of Aboriginal Australia, and calling on, go to China. Go to China. Now the Chinese would probably may not even receive you, but they might well say, yes, we'll go out and talk to our they've got 30 indigenous groups all around the boundaries of China, but they need that sort of leverage now. They need leverage if they're going to get anything done. I think the Labor Party will be better, but the Labor Party is pusillanimous. I'm a member of the Labor Party. I gave my wife away for 16 years to the Labor Party. Shared her with the Labor Party. Not in that sense. So, but I think, there's that lack of real political courage, and I think if the Labor Party comes in, I think they could immediately say, well, it would be difficult to do it by constitutional referendum. So I would set up all these things even by regulation, if you have trouble with the Senate, and get them working and let people see what you're talking about, and then endeavour to get a constitutional change. I mean, the sad thing, the founders felt that the Constitution had been created by the people and voted on, and that should continue to be the case. But I guess they didn't appreciate just how difficult it would be with the two-party system and needing a majority of people in a majority of states. It makes it so difficult.
Turnbull talked about a third house and he used that as his legal excuse. You can't have a third house in Australia. What do you think that meant, legalese?
Well, of course you could. Of course you could. I mean, in a similar way why they won't legislate to give full recognition to local government. But once you've decided the sovereignty can be divided, you can divide it cut it up as many ways as you want to. But you would have to indeed have a significant constitutional referendum. I mean, my belief is I've taught the Constitution, and it's difficult because so much of it is either redundant or doesn't apply anymore, or even more to the point, there's so much about our political system which isn't in the Constitution. So that I think the whole thing's got to be scrapped. But, I doubt if that can happen. We've probably got to patch up. But if you wanted to create as you know, in New Zealand, they had Maori seats in the Parliament from the 19th century, from the 1860s or 1870s. They do in some parts of America. In Maine, they have Indian. There are things that could be done. Except in New Zealand, you've got one House of Parliament, and if you've got a majority, you can do what you like because there's no written constitution. Australia is very, very rigid in that way. But yes, he was using that as a scare tactic because he'd been obviously told by the right-wing people who are so powerful, we won't accept this. So he had to go out and do as he did.
We've got time for one more question.
I'm kind of related to the government.
Sorry?
Kind of related to the government. I found something interesting. I have a friend, an Aboriginal. Well, he identifies very strongly with his Aboriginal heritage. And I found it interesting the contrast between the way he talks about Aboriginality and my other friend. My other friend, she usually speaks in very broad terms. She'll just paint everything as Aboriginal, rarely ever gives specifics. And in respecting and understanding Aboriginal culture, do you have a comment on the line between sort of painting Aboriginal culture as one big mass versus more specific sort of recognition, linguistic differences in groups and such? Yeah.
Well, you've got to begin with indeed the people who are living on their land and usually have their language, and that is your, if you like, your reference point. Now, as you move away from that, it becomes much more complicated, much more difficult, particularly in places like Tasmania and Victoria. So what is Aboriginal? Well, this has particular point to me because we discovered that we almost certainly had a part Aboriginal grandmother we didn't know about. Long after I'd become, known for what my father thought, I have no idea. He may not have known, but he was utterly secretive about his mother and never met her. I mean, after he was a baby. So what does this mean? Am I Aboriginal? Well, I could have indeed said yes, I've got Aboriginal ancestry. I mean, you need other things in the community. You have to say yes, he's one of our mob. But I could have said yes, I'm Aboriginal, but I'm not. My culture is entirely white, Australian, European. My sensibility is entirely European. I know a great deal about it that I've read books. I've known a lot of Aboriginal and Islander people, but that doesn't mean I've crossed from there to there and become Aboriginal. But there is a real problem. Now, I've had this argument, I just had an argument about 2 nights ago about this, I have frequently. Now, the way a person identifies is a matter of a personal choice. It's a bit like if you choose to have a religion. It's a matter of up to you. And if people choose to identify with a part of their heritage, that's their business. Just as, people who've never been to Scotland or are utterly Australian can put on the kilt and blow bagpipes if they want to. The question arises is, does that give you a claim on the rest of society? Particularly a claim for rights and money. And that's where there's always a great difficulty. And in Tasmania it's particularly acute because there's one lot who say we are the only Aborigines, and they are recognised by both the Commonwealth and the state governments. There are the other groups, they all have their corporate organisations. They say, no, we're Aboriginal too. They're recognised by the Commonwealth government, not by the state. So there's this extremely difficult, and as a result, there was a court case about the ATSIC elections, where the real Aborigines, as they see themselves, challenged the right of various people that stand for ATSIC, and it went to the federal court. and he's one of the good judges who have been very supportive of Aboriginal rights. And he said, well, identity is like a form of property. And if you claim identity, the onus, you must assume that that is the case. And you have to be able to prove that they're not Aboriginal. So these people have to take along everything new about their genealogies, and obviously the people in the court did work on it. And the interesting thing is that if you've got a convict ancestor in Tasmania, as so many of us have, not me, if you've got a convict, then you know exactly, because the convict system wrote everything down. So several of these people, it was proved, had convict ancestors. So they were knocked out. You could disprove their claim. But with the others, and it was vague, and there was no certainty about their earliest people in Tasmania, and they said, oh no, we remember old auntie, old grandma Jenny, she was black, so therefore we are Aboriginal. And so if you couldn't prove that they weren't, then they were Aboriginal. The problem in Tasmania was there are a lot of black convicts, a lot of black male convicts. And they, no one's done this yet, looked how they merged into the society, and undoubtedly had children and grandchildren, and that family would remember they had a black ancestor, and they would just assume that they must be Aboriginal. So in many parts of Australia it is very complicated and very difficult, and if people want to claim Aboriginality, that's up to them. But if they then say, well, I want a scholarship, that's a matter of public debate.
I think that's all we've got time for. I'm really sorry. Could you maybe just grab them afterwards for a couple of minutes?
Well, all right, I'm going to push it and just say what I would, so I won't talk about what, but is what can we do? So we've just learnt a lot this morning, and can you tell us, as a largely white audience in a community that's got lots of Aboriginal people that aren't here, what can we take away and do to try and help the visibility of Aboriginal people and help politically help them move things like the Uluru Statement, etc. What can we do? What can we take away?
Yes, well, the important thing is not to go in and say, we're going to help you, right? You need our help. No, you make it known that perhaps the Institute is there if they would like to come and discuss, and if they want advice. I mean, the most practical thing is who among you have got practical skills they might use, and see what they want, and they won't be of one mind. But I mean, this book that I've got coming out again is about the white humanitarians, and they were wonderful people. But in the end, the Aborigines said, look, we're sick of you lot,
But is there something we can do, like the way we spend our money or politically, that not necessarily having to engage with Indigenous people, but what can we do to help improve the visibility or the conversations?
Well, just be there. Make it apparent that you are there, but you've got to wait till they come to you. I mean, when we went to Townsville, one of the things we did immediately, Margaret set up a kindergarten, a Head Start kindergarten. It's still going. And we would go around and knock on doors and say, hello there, would your kids like to come to kindergarten? And some of them did, a lot of them did. I mean, the Mabo children came. And it is now, and has been for 50 years, now an Aboriginal run kindergarten. But that sort of well-meaning, earnest young white people going and saying, hello, we've come to help you.
Thank you. Good.